You know, everyone is talking about the Joe Rogan Experience episode with Dr. Jordan Peterson, and this portion was cut out of the clip, but I think it is imperative to understand the context in which the statements that were made about the Bible, the structure of society, how it works, should have been kept in there. And we're gonna talk about the reason why this is such an important subject in just a second. But what you're going to see here is the analogy that is made with the structure of society and the collapse thereof when focused on gender, sex, and the things related. So listen to this real quick.
I'm sure you're familiar with Douglas Murray's work.
Yes, and Murray, who's very funny, who I like very much, and who's one of the most courageous people I've ever met.
Yeah, he's brilliant. And he had an amazing point about civilizations collapsing, and that when they start collapsing, they become obsessed with gender. And he was saying that you could trace it back to the ancient Romans, the Greeks.
Yeah, Camille Paglia has made much of that.
Yeah,
I think probably it's not so much an obsession with gender; it's a disintegration of categories as a precursor. Like, so it's a marker for if categories dissolve, especially fundamental ones, the culture is dissolving because the culture is a structure of category. Mm-hmm. That's what it is. Right. So, and in fact, culture is a structure of category that we all share. So we see things the same way. Well, that's why we can talk. I mean, not exactly the same way, because then we'd have nothing to talk about. But roughly speaking, we have a bedrock of agreement. That's the Bible, by the way.
Just hear that long pause there, okay? That long pause should give everyone pause, because what he said was extremely profound. Nothing new, but it was profound, especially coming from a person like Dr. Jordan Peterson. He's unveiling something that we all not only know to be true, but he's unveiling the historic reality of that statement. We've always known in our heart of hearts, and especially for those who are Christians, have seen this over and over again in our Bibles, as well as in history. You heard Joe Rogan reference it just a moment ago. You heard him tell you that this is something that you find even back in Greek and Roman times. And obviously, I would say it goes back all the way to the beginning when sin entered the world. But this is the next clip that you all probably have seen by now, where he injects the very comment about the Bible being the structure of society. Take a listen.
So I just walked through the Museum of the Bible in Washington. That was very cool. It's a very cool museum.
So the structure, that's what the Bible
it's what
provides.
I figured out. I mean, I just figured this out this week. So it was a cool thing to walk through, because it's chronological. They have one floor which is the history of the Bible. But it's not exactly that. It's really what it is the history of the book. Now, in many ways, the first book was the Bible. I mean, literally, because at one point there was only one book. Like, as far as our Western culture is concerned, there was one book. And for a while, literally, there was only one book. And that book was the Bible. And then before it was the Bible, it was it was scrolls, and it was writings on papyrus. But we were starting to aggregate written text together. And it went through all sorts of technological transformations, and then it became books that everybody could buy, the book everybody could buy, and the first one of those was the Bible. And then it became all sorts of books that everybody could buy. But all those books, in some sense, emerged out of that underlying book. And that book itself, the Bible isn't a book, it's a library. It's a collection of books. And so what I figured out was, partly because I was talking to my brother-in-law, Jim Keller, who's the world's greatest chip designer and has now designed a chip that's as powerful as the human brain, which is optimized for artificial intelligence learning, by the way. And so I talked to him about that. He said, "You heard of the internet?" I said, "Yeah, Jim, I've heard of the internet." He said, "This is way more revolutionary than that." So in any case, we were talking about meaning in text, because we were talking about translation and the problem of understanding text. And Jim said, the meaning of words is coded in the relationship of the words to one another. And the postmodernists make that case, that all meaning is derived from the relationship between words. That's wrong, because, well, what about rage? That's not words. And what about moving your hand? That's not words. So it's wrong, but part of it's right, because the meaning we derive from the verbal domain is encoded in the relationship between words. So now then you think, well, let's think about the relationship between words. Well, some words are dependent on other words. Some ideas are dependent on other ideas. The more ideas are dependent on a given idea, the more fundamental that idea is. That's a definition of fundamental. So now imagine you have an aggregation of texts in a civilization. You say, which are the fundamental texts? And the answer is, the texts upon which most other texts depend. And so you'd put Shakespeare way in there in English, because so many texts are dependent on Shakespeare's literary revelations. And Milton would be in that category, and Dante would be in that category, at least in translation. Fundamental authors, part of the Western canon, not because of the arbitrary dictates of power, but because those texts influenced more other texts. And then you think about that as a hierarchy, okay, with the Bible at its base, which is certainly the case. Now imagine that's the entire corpus of linguistic production, all things considered. Now, how do you understand that? Like, literally, how do you understand that? Well, the answer is, you sample it by reading and listening to stories and listening to people talk. You sample that whole domain. You build a low-resolution representation of that inside you, and then you listen and see through that. And so it isn't that the Bible is true. It's that the Bible is the precondition for the manifestation of truth, which makes it way more true than just true.
Holy moly, guys. What he said in totality was way more poignant and way more insightful, especially into the reality of reality, okay? The reality that transcends what we experience in this world, notably and namely because the scriptures are true. And it is because the fact that it has come from the truth giver. With that being said, I want you to remember what was just said by both Joe Rogan and Dr. Jordan Peterson, and realize that what they were talking about was the collapse of civilization due to the nature of the collapsing of genders, sexuality, kind of all of those into one. And there's a reason why this collapse happens, and it says in Romans chapter 1, verse 20, "For since the creation of this world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him or give him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations." You see that collapse that happens in the human mind? They became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, changing genders maybe, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, and birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. Therefore, because this collapse is happening in the mind of man, and it's due to the fact they're not honoring God, therefore God does something now. It says, "Therefore God gave them over in the lusts of their heart to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them." Okay, this is very key to understanding really everything that Dr. Jordan Peterson is speaking about regarding the collapse of culture, the collapse of generations of knowledge. He already stated that the Bible is the structure by which the world works. It is because it is the blueprint that has been given to us by an all-knowing God to people who are fallen images of God. okay? And it doesn't end there, okay? Because he said that their bodies would be dishonored among them. Consider what's happening with quote-unquote gender dysphoria and sex changes and body dysmorphia and all of those amalgamations of those things. In verse 25, it continues. It says, "For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen." For this reason, the continued collapse of culture, for this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions. For their women exchanged the natural function for what is unnatural, and in the same way also the men abandoned the natural function of the woman and burned in their desire toward one another, men with men, committing indecent acts and receiving in their own person the due penalty of their error. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things which are not proper, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful, and altogether they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death. They not only do the same, but also give hearty approval to those who practice them. Just consider what's happening here, and what has happened here is the very unveiling of God's glory in his judgment towards people who do not acknowledge God. And guess what ends up happening? The destruction of God in the minds of men and in the hearts of men cause culture to collapse. Amazing.